Why hello there, and welcome back to Tabletop Ferox. Now, if you are a long-term viewer of the channel, you may recall that I am not particularly fond of Dungeons & Dragons 4th edition. However, just because the end result was less than ideal doesn't mean that it was devoid of positive qualities. There were some, which I will now discuss in this Top 1d10 Dungeons & Dragons 4th edition features. Which of course means that I will have to roll to determine how many features I will be talking about. And it looks like I will be starting with number 9, Powers. Powers are, of course, the most distinctive feature of Dungeons & Dragons 4th edition. And the thing is, when you start playing, they're pretty cool. Like, the fighter has their own set of unique attacks, just like the wizard. And also, they really standardized, like, all of the abilities, at least in terms of format, which, made some things easier to understand. However, as time goes on and you play the game more and more, your list of powers starts to feel more like a list of things your character can do. And overall, kinda starts to make all of the classes feel kinda similar. It also created a situation where a lot of content needed to be created for every single class, because there had to be an entire list of powers for every class. And also, Paragon Paths and Epic Destinies, which meant that each class's entry ended up taking like 14 pages in the book. And I will say, they did actually try to fix the power system in the Dungeons & Dragons Essentials, but I guess it was just too little, too late. So now, on to number 8, Character Roles. So in 4th edition, every class was defined as either a controller, a defender, a leader, or a striker. And very similar to powers, it was a thing that was very neat at first. All of the leader characters had healing powers, so a warlord or a bard were an effective healer for your team. They weren't as good of a healer as a cleric, but you could definitely get by with just any leader character in your healing role. Unfortunately, the idea that a bard is interchangeable with a cleric, a fighter with a paladin, a wizard with a druid, and a rogue with a warlock just kinda started to feel like there were 4 classes. Like, every class had unique features and their own set of unique powers, and sometimes they actually tried to mix it up a little bit, but when taken as a whole, the distinctive characteristics of each class within a particular role just kind of even out. And very closely related to the roles, number 7, Power Sources. In addition to a role, each class also had a power source, originally arcane, divine, or martial, and then later primal, psionic, and shadow. And similar to the roles, it was kind of a cool thing, like at least thematically, because putting all of the classes into these different groups said, this is how these particular groups of classes get their power. It was a thematic way of saying how the powers of a wizard and a bard are different from those of a cleric and a paladin, or a druid and a shaman. And on its own, there is absolutely no fault with the system. It is completely fine. The problem was what they did to support it. Basically, when they added new power sources, they had to add new classes for those power sources to fill all of the roles. So for example, when they added psionic characters, they actually had a slightly different power system than the rest of the characters, which was kind of a cool thing. Instead of encounter powers, they had at-will powers and power points that they could spend to augment their at-will powers. That is every psionic class except the monk. And it really just felt like the monk had the psionic power source slapped on it because they needed a psionic controller, a psionic defender, a psionic leader, and a psionic striker. And the monk was their psionic striker, even though they didn't really have psionic powers. Similarly, it also felt like the Barbarian was only given the primal power source because they needed a primal striker, although that one is more arguable as, whether a Barbarian's powers are physical or spiritual is, a topic for debate. Although personally, I would classify a Barbarian as a martial class. And interesting note though, on martial classes, they never added a new one. There were 4 martial classes in the player's handbook, and they never added a new martial class. They added new arcane classes, they added new divine classes, they added 3 new power sources, but they just never added a new martial class. Aside from the monk and the barbarian, who should have been martial classes. So, now on to number 6, the Bloodied Condition. In 4th edition, a character who was at half their hit points or lower was considered to be bloodied, and certain effects would only work for bloodied characters or on bloodied characters. For example, a tiefling got a +1 bonus to attacks against bloodied enemies, and a dragonborn got a +1 bonus to their attacks when they themselves were bloodied. And yes, it's not really necessary to define a condition for being at half hit points or lower. There have been abilities before and since that have done so without a bloodied condition, but they didn't just have this condition defined, they actually used it a lot, and it was kind of a neat thing to have this additional condition on abilities, to be able to say, oh, here's the ability that I can use when I'm bloodied, or here's the ability I can use against a bloodied enemy, or here's an ability I have, and if the enemy is bloodied, they are extra boned by it. So that's all of that, and on to number 5, returning weapons. Thrown weapons are one of those things that have never really worked out incredibly well, and 4th edition tried to fix that by making any magical thrown weapon automatically return after being thrown. Because in previous editions, if you had a magic javelin or hand axe or a dagger, you weren't really going to want to throw that, because then your magic weapon could become the enemy's magic weapon. There was, of course, a returning enchantment that you could put on magic items in 3rd edition, but that was an extra +1 enhancement you would have to put onto your thrown weapon to make it actually usable, when you could just use a bow instead. But in 4th edition, you could now throw your magic weapon without having to worry about losing it or paying an additional enhancement cost. Also, they did try to fix crossbows a little bit, but I think we've all just given up on crossbows at this point. Anyway, on to number 4, defenses. In 4th edition, instead of a Fortitude, Reflex, and Will save, you had a Fortitude, Reflex, and Will defense, which was kind of a necessary change given how the power system kinda blurred the lines between a melee attack and a spell. And yes, technically it could have worked with saves, but just given the structure of the rest of the game, it made a lot more sense to simplify it to a active player always rolls system. That being said, I do actually like the 5th edition 6 saves better than the 4th edition defenses or the 3rd edition 3 saves. And speaking of 3s, number 3, fixed hit point values. Alright, let's be honest here. Rolling for hit points is stupid. It's one of those things like preparing spells that's only lasted as long as it has because it's just the way it's been done. Because here's the thing, a wizard can roll a 1 on their d4 and it's not that big of a deal, but a barbarian can roll a 1 on their d12 and that's much more of a problem. And yes, you could roll a 1 at one level and a 12 at the next level and it'll just kind of average out, but if the high rolls and the low rolls and the mid rolls are just going to average out, then why not just take the average hit points? So now on to number 2, distance in squares. Now, I don't know about you, but I love counting out my distances in 5-foot increments with each second diagonal being 10 feet as much as the next person, which I assume is not very much. And 4th edition just kinda got rid of that and gave you distances in squares, so an average character has a speed of 6 squares instead of 30 feet, because just like 3rd edition, it was very much designed to have combat play out on a grid. And 1 square was still 5 feet, it says that in the book. Overland speed is still given in miles, but they just took out the step of you having to convert distances to squares in the midst of combat. Also, they got rid of the additional cost for diagonal movement and simplified the shapes of cones and just other spell areas into simple squares, which, yes, is not the most realistic way to calculate the area of a spell being cast by your elven wizard, but it's faster and easier, and ironically, 4th edition actually did streamline some things to make combat quicker, but then also added a bunch of stuff that made it even slower. But finally, number 1, minions. Similar to character roles, 4th edition also had monster roles, and minions were monsters that were effectively just like regular monsters, with the important distinction that they only had 1 hit point. And this filled a very important niche, because previously, if you wanted to have a lot of enemies in an encounter, you would have to use ones that were relatively weak in terms of their attacks and defenses, which would either barely be a threat, or could be surprisingly overpowered. Like, I'm pretty sure the only total party kill I ever got in Pathfinder was at the bony hands of 10 skeletons. CR 1/3 creatures, which altogether should have been an appropriately leveled encounter, and individually should have been pushovers. But with minions, you could have appropriately leveled monsters that were just guaranteed to go down in 1 hit. And from the player side, cutting through waves of minions or just blasting them with fireballs was a fairly satisfying experience, somewhat counter to the rest of 4th edition combat. And that was my top 1d10 Dungeons & Dragons 4th edition features. Do you agree? Disagree? I don't really care, but you can still voice your opinion on that topic in the comments. It's a thing that you can do here on the YouTube. And thank you for watching, with extra special thanks to my Fightin' Flail Snails, Samuel Gorski, and Randy Mulholland. If you want to be cool like them, check out my Patreon, where you can get early access to videos and fun stuff that I make for the Patreon. Also, there's a Ko-fi too, but if you don't want to do any of that stuff, that's cool too. You can still hit all the lovely buttons, like, subscribe, these other videos that either myself or the YouTube algorithm have lovingly selected for you, which I am sure are lovely videos that you will also enjoy. And I will see you next time.